topic for tonight, it addresses directly the capacity for the meaning maker, what I call the soul. So that's why poems address us, is because they go straight to the part of us that is invested in our search for meaning. So thank you again for another wonderful poem. I want to go to my topic tonight. As I wrote in my Shabbat email to you, I'm suffused in the work of Viktor Frankl, partly as an act of grieving. It's as if we've been attending a national Shiva Minyan here. And instead of a prayer book, I've been reading Frankl every day because I'm asking my question, um, not not what does it mean what we've gone through, because what we've gone through is the infliction of evil, but how do we find meaning in the infliction of evil? So I read Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is, by the way, not the original title of his book. It was, I think, something like the Doctor in the Holocaust. And then later on, as he developed logotherapy more in the English translation, it was a Man's Search for Meaning. And it's the second half of the book where he discusses what I want to call it meaning therapy, because logotherapy already makes it sound a bit academic and somehow devoted to this thing called logos, which is not. But if we say something like, and if therapy means healing, finding healing in the world of meaning would be the best way in my mind to describe logotherapy. It's not a short, elegant word, but I think it more describes, if you read the corpus of what Frankl has written, especially to popular audiences, it really is therapy in the sense of healing, finding therapy in the world of in the realm of finding healing in the realm of meaning. And so one thing I've done is I've jumped to one of his later books, and I think as I'm reading through it, I I really think I want to teach Viktor Frankl over the next several weeks, and not teach it in the order of the books were written, because sometimes he conceives of something later, and then one can see his later thought through his earlier thought through his later thought. So I want to study with you from a book that he called um, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Um, and excuse the word man, I'm not going to try to correct it. If I say the human search, it sounds a little bit differently. But of course, by Menschlichkeit in German, they mean humanity. So Mensch in German means a human being, especially in the Yiddish version, a fine human being. It doesn't refer to males, obviously. You just need to get that out of the way. So it's a Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning is actually a collection of essays. And one of the essays is um, the chapter two, the spiritual unconscious is here. Um, he has a reference to another book of his called the Unbewusste Gott, the unconscious God. So there's lots of work in the later work, with lots of ideas in his later work that have a specific religious concern. Now, when I say religious concern, he doesn't mean a religion, although he was a devoted Jew his entire life. He never wrote much, as far as I know, about Judaism in particular. But he saw religion in its best form as addressing the human search for or drive toward ultimate meaning. But of course, using religion as part of the drive for ultimate meaning is very fraught, because most religion is practiced and taught so poorly in terms of people seeking ultimate meaning. And here's where, as I said last week, I'll continue to say, he's very much reminds me of Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was a German Protestant and theologian. He was a chaplain in the German army in World War I and had a crisis of faith. He no longer believed in Lutheran Christianity after the First World War. And in the context of German philosophy between the wars, he met many, many great scholars of religion. And Paul Tillich conceived of the God beyond God and religion beyond religion. So for all of those who find religion dissatisfying, you might put at the top of the list the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, who felt that for spiritually seeking people, it's all taught so badly because they can't find the God beyond God because they're trapped in theology, or from Frankl's perspective, they can't find the unbewusste, the unconscious God, or the ultimate meaning, because that's not how it's taught. So the way that I tried to teach it, um, but again, no matter how much we teach, there has to be the internalization of this by the listener. So I want to be teaching from the book. I just want to make sure I have the title right. Um, Hold on a second. I have my yes, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Um, and I'm going to be teaching from the preface is very worthwhile, but I want to teach from the first chapter, and um, and then I'll bring a little biblical teaching in the meantime. So what reading the first chapter does is it gives you a great insight into the context in which Viktor Frankl, as a young man, was forming his thoughts. He's born in 1905. He's highly precocious. He had a correspondence with Sigmund Freud. I think he gave his first paper at the age of 16. He already had ideas firmly in his mind in the 1930s. He was the head of a very large section of the Jewish hospital in Vienna. Um, he reports having, especially in a department dealing with suicidal people. He was in charge of thousands of suicidal people, had a staff under him, and he counseled many of them. So he says in the book that Frankel's ideas came out of counseling suicidal people. And when he realized was how profoundly useless Freudian psychology was in counseling suicidal people, people who had attempted suicide, and even how profoundly the other psychological systems were. He specifically focuses on Alfred Adler, who's very worthwhile studying, but he said Freud doesn't work, and Adler didn't work, and the others didn't work. Even the humanists, for whom he has great regard, at some level, humanism, as inspiring as it is, I love reading Erich Fromm and Abraham Maslow. It's hard to apply them into a clinical setting. So he starts out um, discussing the essence of existential analysis. And that's a really good word. In fact, Rabbi Manning a year ago at High Holidays spent an entire High Holiday season discussing existentialism. So it's never far from my mind, never far from her mind. Something worthwhile studying, but again, I think you need a bit of a guide. So let me just discuss this word existentialism just for a moment. So existentialism, again, there's no actual um, named movement. People write and they are called an existentialist, sometimes very begrudgingly. People are called an existentialist. Um, People resist the title, but it's a useful term. When you think of existentialism, see it initially as opposed to the term essentialism. Essentialism believes that there is a known essence to the human being, a known essence to the human being. The German word is uh, Wesenheit. And toward the end of the 19th century, the medical model had become the regnant idea. And the essence of the human became, and this is one of the awful unintended consequences of Freud and the others, is human being became a mechanism. Notice we talk about defense mechanisms. Even the idea of superego, ego, is a mechanistic kind of a hydraulic theory that repression pushes down and symptoms come up. And if you talk and relieve your symptoms, the pressure comes off and the symptoms go down. So people have described Freud's theories as in many ways profoundly mechanistic, and many other theories that we are only a function of our biology, only a function of genes. When genes were discovered. So the essence of the human being came to be understood as underground drives and forces that produced our consciousness, and that consciousness was understood to be an epiphenomenon. Epiphenomenon meaning not the real thing, it's the thing you notice. It's the tree above the root system. If the root system is the real thing, then what's above the girth is the epiphenomenon. It's a, as it were, an indication of something happening going on more deeply. So that's one kind of essentialism. Another kind is religious, where religious people would come along and say, well, the essence of the human being is, and they would repeat some kind of religious doctrine, or the essence of a human being. You go along with Aristotle. So each system of thought had its own sense of what was called later philosophic anthropology, meaning a philosophy about what the human being is. And depending on what the human being is, from that we would understand what the problem of the human being is. Meaning, if you were in a religious setting, I remember being told that this was this is not a myth. The person said this to me that he was in a yeshiva setting, and his rabbi said, "You look so down," and he said, "Well, my girlfriend broke up with me, and I'm really miserable." And the rabbi said, "Well, did you put on tefillin today? You know, if you put on tefillin, you wrap tefillin, then like a lot of life's problems go away." And yeah, sometimes if you just have a discipline and you forget about your problems at one level, but he said the rabbi didn't mean it that way. He says, well, you're not miserable because of your girlfriend. You're miserable because you didn't put on tefillin. So, get back to work. There's some wisdom there, but there's some non-wisdom there as well. Uh, so if you look at the different religions, if your essence is to fulfill religious dogma, then that's the answer. So you might say we're born into essentialism. We're born into answers about the human condition. And the problem with the answers run out. I mean, you might just say, well, I'm a good Jew, I'm a good Catholic, I went to a psychoanalyst. Um, let's say you obey another kind of essentialism. I'm a good boy, I'm a good girl, I got good grades in school, I turned in my papers, and I'm doing what my parents wanted me to do, but I still feel miserable nonetheless. Or I've made a lot of money. I have a nice house. I've fulfilled the so-called American dream, and all I have are nightmares. So people try to, fulfill the something essentialist, and they still feel misery. So already in the some of the great those who produced the existentialist mode were Dostoevsky, one, Franz Kafka, and others that tried to uncover a kind of a sense of desperation, of depression at the heart of many human beings, especially in the secular world. So existentialism came to be known as not really nihilism, that nothing matters, but rather you'll have to face existence on your own and not rely on the essentialism of another tradition. So you don't start by saying, well, I have a system, let me try the system, but rather take a moment where you back off, take a big step back and you look at it. You look at the answers that have been given you, either by your studies, your culture, your religion, and you are skeptical. So one of the themes of existentialism is skepticism. I'm skeptical whether any of these things are ultimately true. They're not, there's nothing is ultimately true but the ultimate truth. Everything can be assessed. And if we have our spiritual lights about us, we can have criterion for how we assess things. I think there's actually a political dimension to this. I think existentialism does not trust any political system, any political answer. Um, therefore, there's great resistance to joining any specific ideological or political tribe, because even ideological and political tribes claim to have all the answers. And if you ask the wrong question, you can be banished from the tribe. So being in the existentialist mode, um, you, you end up developing, by the way, there's a famous existentialist book called The Homeless Mind, meaning a part of what having a mind at home is finding a home, finding other people, which is a great thing. The problem is if you're, as it were, born into a home or pushed into a home or select a home without really thinking, you can get banished if you ask the wrong question, if you think the wrong thought. So I think part of what we try to create at Or HaTorah is a home for skeptics, a home for independent thinkers, a home for people that, as long as you're civil and can make a case, you can think anything you want within reason and say anything you want within reason. Um, there's the person says, I don't believe in God, you can say that. I don't believe in Kabbalah, you can say that, make a case, and then hear a response. I mean, the only thing we require here really is thoughtfulness if you're going to speak, and respect for other people. Other than that, we want to create a place where truth is not taught, although I do try to teach true things. Truth is uncovered, which is a deep part of my teaching. I'm trying to figure it out, and I'm trying to figure it out in front of you. So existentialism, think of it as prioritizing existence over essence, and eventually existentialism found its way into, what's the core thing you discover in existence. Unless you stripped everything back. I don't trust any system. I don't trust natural sciences, biological sciences. I mean, they have their uses, but they don't address the meaning of life. I don't trust any particular psychological school, meaning all of them are useful as tools, but they're not the, as it were, the essence of me. Um, so without naming all of the existentialist thinkers, they came down to one concept that I think all of them have agreed upon, those who took a spiritual term, and that is the German word Sorgen. Sorgen means worry or concern, especially about others. In my existentialist skepticism, there are other people here. And if there are not other people, there's somebody waiting for you. I mean, if you're of a gifted, sentient soul, and you're able to step back and not buy into any system, and you discover somehow your own existentialist sincerity behind existentialist skepticism, there's another person waiting for you to help them on the path. So part of the existentialist mode is addressing the human being as the human being is. Addressing the human being as the human being is. I remember even as a young person, as I would read aphorisms, and on my own search. Let me share you something I've shared before. I remember when I was about 17, I was at the Long Beach Jewish Community Center in Long Beach in the library, and I saw a book of Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim. I said, well, I heard about it. My rabbi never taught me about it. I heard the word. I heard there's like something called a Hasidic story. Let me see what it is. So I pulled out a volume. I opened it up, and it said in the English, uh, three things, uh, 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 an ehrliche Yid, a true Jew, a true human being, is constituted by three things. It said, if I want to get the right order, um, upright kneeling, motionless dance, and silent screaming. I shuddered. I've never thinking, this has been all this time in the Long Beach Jewish Community Center library. My breath was taken away, and I thought, well, who's this rabbi? I looked his name up, and I sat down, began to read the book, and I thought, wow, I am, this Jewish kid, and I've inherited this whole thing, and in Hebrew school we never study Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim. Well, I became a Hasid immediately, and as you read through the book, what you read through the book is the tone of the Baal Shem Tov, who's the produces the um, mostly 18th, 19th century phenomenon called Hasidism, is a kind of deep religious skepticism on one hand, but existentialist concern on the other. I mean, there's some deep happening inside of the human being, and traditional religion doesn't face this. So when they ask the Hasidic rabbi, what's the three most important things of a Jew? Shabbos, kosher, and davening. Just no. That's not it. What's the three most important things a Jew can do? Go to Reform synagogue, social action, and save the marginalized people. Okay, that's important too. What is it? He says, um, uh, um, upright kneeling, um, silent screaming, and motionless dance, something like that. That's, if you want to know what it's all about, that's where you start. So that is a deep existentialist attitude there. It's not the big system. It's not the 613 commandments. He could have easily gone that route, but he didn't. So I want to tell you that And remember, these Hasidic masters are writing in the late 17 and early 1800s. Many people see the writings of the Hasidic masters having influenced Kierkegaard and influenced Nietzsche and many others. Especially once the literature was translated from Yiddish into German, it was widely available. So in any case, in this first chapter, he calls the essence of existential analysis. In the chapter, he says it's not a method. You might know some methods, but you don't bring the method. What you bring is non-method to a person suffering and encounter them, a human being in their suffering. And you have to find out the meaning of their suffering without a method. And within their suffering, you might say a world appears, the world in which their suffering appears, because suffering always takes place inside of an internal world, especially the world of what you thought your life is supposed to be like and what it became. And then the counselor has to, as it were, enter into that world without a method, but rather if the counselor is a competent healer, competent and gifted, the path toward healing comes from the encounter. You think of Martin Buber's Ich und du, I and you. Yeah, Buber says these I you moments are grenzeless. They're bound. They're not boundaried by something of how it's supposed to be. The truth comes out of the moment. So existential analysis. When you think of existentialism, think of authenticity, which is a big word in existentialism. Authenticity means something like being real to the moment. I spoke a couple of weeks ago about authenticity as a function of what I might call the true self. And not as if the true self is some static thing that I discovered, but it's a mode of being to understand my motivations as much as I can, understand my inner life, understand my hopes, my dreams, my pains, my achievements, my failures, and be present to all of that, and especially present when life demands it of me. The fullness of my being is called forth, and therefore what I try not to do, and I go into a situation, is put on a mask, an inauthentic mask, and pretend to be something or go in there to work the situation. Now, of course, we always have to wear something of a mask. We have to find our way in a world of other human beings. We can't be fully raw and true at every moment. But so there is some manufacturing of the self, but the distance between the mask and the true self should be a small distance. And therefore, when you have the opportunity to meet an authentic human being, the authenticity of each person is apparent. You say to yourself, ah, I'm in the presence of an authentic human being. So when you think about existentialism, think that whatever the truth of your being is can be brought forth and encounter the again, as much as is reasonably possible, the truth of another human being. It's like truth meets truth. So I'm not saying these are canonical definitions of the word, but when I think of the true self as more of an inner work and authenticity, roughly more interpersonal, meaning I've met an authentic person or I try to be authentic with other people. So during his time working with suicidal patients, which was a life-forming experience for Viktor Frankl, he realized that you can't come to a person who wants to kill themselves with a method. And because if I have a method, they become an object. One has to encounter them in the fullness of their suffering and only bring to it, the truth of my being in an authentic encounter. Of course, Frankl, he lived in Austria. He had read Buber. He had read these others. So this was not something original to him, but he made clinical use of it. And this is one thing he talks about is people did not know how to make clinical use of these humanistic ideas. There were great books that people read, but when you got into the hospital, as a clinician, you had to be clinical. So this was happening for him in the 1930s, and he was already working toward, um, a healing through meaning, i.e., logotherapy during that time, and even working toward the search for ultimate meaning, meaning his idea of mining typically spiritual concerns, in so-called psychiatry. Now, psychiatry, we think of a physician who can prescribe medicine, Just remember, iatry, the Greek word iatry, just means healing, and psyche, of course, means soul. So psychiatry originally just meant the healing of the inner life, but more properly, the healing of the soul. Psychology is the logos of the psyche, the teaching of the soul. Psychiatry, etymologically, is the healing of the soul. It came to mean a psychiatrist is a doctor who can prescribe medicine, but move away from that. A psychiatrist is ideally a healer of the soul. A psychologist is someone who has mastered the theory of the soul, the logos of the soul. It's very important to keep those words in mind. So, again, when I think of myself in my own work, I see myself both as someone who's trying to form a theory of the soul, and for myself and others, a healer of the soul. So part of what we do here is psychology and psychiatry in its original understanding. Um, so he goes in to the camp, and man's search for meaning is not a chronology of his being in the camps at all. It's more or less his recalling things where he was both the sufferer, the observer, the advisor during that time. In the second half of the book, the edition that I have is a discussion of logotherapy. So later on, he's putting all this together and he says, let me start all over again. So, so in many ways, this is a voice against Freud, a voice against Adler and others. So what's the problem with Freud? And the problem with Freud is still present in much therapeutic practice. I mentioned last week when I was looking for my beloved, my teacher of the soul, Viktor Wolfenstein, beloved to me. I studied with him at times 4 times a week for 17 years, mostly doing dream work, but all kinds of other things. He considered himself a trained psychoanalyst, saw himself as a Buddhist, very interested in, also taught Plato at UCLA. You can look him up. Very interested in my work as a Kabbalist because Plato and Kabbalah are cousins of each other. And we went from being, my psychoanalyst to my teacher. He wanted to give me a license to do psychoanalysis. Says, come to my school. I'll run you through it. And I said, I'll do it as a rabbi, but he definitely gave me the 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 learning that I could have gotten a credential, decided not to. And he passed away suddenly, and at age 67 years old in 2010. I was bereft. I lost my teacher, my friend, my mentor, my older brother, as it were. And I thought, well, I need to find a supervisor. I told last week I went to somebody and said I need a supervisor, and I really don't need to go through therapy again. I had 17 years, sometimes 4 times a week, so I'm good. I need someone to run cases by. She says, well, nevertheless, I don't want to take you on unless I'm sure that you've been worked out. So let's start with your mother. I went, you're kidding me. Okay, fine. I'll talk about my mother for an hour. I paid the fee, and I thought, well, I guess. By the way, I found people to run cases by. Helena, thank you. Uh, I found wonderful people here at the synagogue who have functioned as supervisors for me. Um, so in any case, the the doctor of the soul, as he called himself. I think of my mentor Victor, because Victor was a trained Freudian who actually far transcended Freud. But what was Freud? Freud was mechanistic, and in much psychotherapy, not my teacher Victor Wolfenstein, but some psychotherapy, you still walk in and they have a picture. You suffered from trauma. The trauma was inflicted by your parents, and you have unresolved mother and father things to work out. That's probably absolutely true, but that might not be the source of your suffering. You only know the source of the suffering if the person wants to get rid of the theory and listen to you. Um, I've often spoken about a case when I worked in a drug alcohol rehab center. We were very concerned at watching the behavior of the clients, what kind of um, permissions they would get. The less you acted like an addict, the more you could use your phone and go out for a day and so on and so forth. And one guy was using his newly acquired access to the internet by ordering stuff from Amazon. And there was concern that it was obsessive and signs of regression. obsessive attachment to objects. Like instead of sucking his thumb, he was ordering stuff off of Amazon. So they wanted to regress him in the system, take away privileges, and provide a diagnosis. And he got very upset. And I was his personal counselor, and I was invited to the meeting where the head of the center and the in-house psychologist and I met. And I could barely contain my rage. He had been reduced to an object. He'd been reduced to a symptom. And and they talked about that, said it was becoming obsessive. I said, so what? I mean, he liked, so what did he buy, by the way? Like pencil holders, things to organize his room. I said, he likes to organize his room. He's not hurting anybody. Well, it's a bit obsessive. I said, according to what? Well, obsessively collecting things that organizers is the evidence of an unorganized life. I said, yeah, he was an alcoholic, a drug addict, was in prison for 4 years. His life might be a little bit under control, feel a little bit out of control. I said, I said, he's a gem. He's beautiful. He's struggling through deep things, and y'all are reducing him to a set of symptoms. Come on. And I thought, well, I'll get fired again. Kind of taking on the diagnosis of the real psychologist in the center. And here I am, just a rabbi, not a licensed psychologist. And I said, this is a violation of his humanity, and it's indignifying. And I'm sorry, I can't be here if this is the way it's going to go. And to their credit, they really heard me. I made a case, and I was willing to get fired, and they listened to me, and I made a passionate defense. I said, you got to see him as a whole human being. He's not a symptom. And it was a real deep moment between the three of us. And they really thanked me and thanked for being on staff. And this is what we're about. We're about challenging each other and growing together, which was true, by the way. I mean, it was a very special place. And I had people I had people correct me and people correct me. That was the culture of the place. I didn't quite know that yet. But this is an example where psychologist, who's a beautiful human being, I think she just made a mistake, because I make mistakes, made a mistake and went back to method. And it took me to come in and be the more existentialist. And the director listened to us both and made sucked in. He's a person, not a symptom. And so when you think of Viktor Frankl and his taking on the Freudian establishment, and he paid a price for that. He says, we are not mechanistic. We're not an assembly of drives. When you think about psychoanalysis, what does psychoanalysis means? Analysis means breaking something down into components. So the psychoanalyst wants to break you down into components, look at all the different components, and find out where the suffering is. You might say where the quarrel is, the antagonisms of the inner life, and somehow bring you to some kind of reconciliation, as if that's what we are, is the function of competing forces in their life. There is some truth to that, but that's not all of who we are. So his taking on of Freud was taking on the very idea of psychoanalysis, meaning analyzing the psyche into components and somehow bringing some kind of relief by bringing peace to the warring parts of the inner life, and therefore reducing the pressure on the id, making the superego back off so the ego could flourish. For what? I mean, why is the ego here? Why should it flourish? He then took on Alfred Adler, again, a person of whom I have inordinate respect, because Alfred Adler saw not in this kind of closed system of id, the drives, the uber-ish, the self above the self pushing down, and the ego getting squeezed in and trying to survive. Adler put that aside, and again, I'm giving a broad brush analysis. It's the drive to the assertion of self. So try to imagine you're brought up in a family. They have a plan for you. They know who you are. They know what you're supposed to do, kind of what you're supposed to think, what you're supposed to accomplish. And if you're not doing it, they get tutors. I've known people who they weren't where they were supposed to be. And the family, instead of saying, wait, let's get to know our kid, not what we want our kid to be, who our kid is, they hire an army of tutors to make the kid stay on the program. And, kind of anything, but wait, let's back all the way off and see how this young person wants to assert him or herself in life. So Adler really respected what we might call the drive to power, but it's misunderstood. He didn't mean power for its own sake, meaning the person who's being almost deformed by being pushed into a form, take the forms off, relatively speaking, and understand what that person's authentic drive to realization is. So Adler said they're not suffering because of their toilet training or because of desire for the mother and castration anxiety from the father. They're suffering because they're hobbled, because they haven't been encouraged to seek their own authentic entelechy, the own fullness of their own being. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. A lot of people suffer because they're not taught from an early age to understand themselves and what the fullness of their own life would look like. I mean, even in an open society like ours, I see kids, sent to the private school, and more or less you better buckle down and fit in and get along with the program. Remember one case I shared with you where the um, son was estranged from his parents because he said, "I want to be a firefighter." They said, "We're paid, these hundreds of $1,000s for you at Harvard Westlake and this fancy school. You want to be a fighter? Like, what a ridiculous idea to risk your life to go into great danger to save other people. What a horrible way to spend your time, right?" So he broke off with them. He couldn't help them understand. He was seeking for, courage and bravery and it wasn't exactly it was not the military, but kind of like that. I want to face evil and danger to save people. Well, they wouldn't have anything to do with it. They were eventually estranged. So when you think of Adler, think of the assertion of the buried fullness of one's being and taking out both familial and societal, cultural and religious inhibitions. Now remember, when you're talking to a suicidal patient, that might matter. Freud might matter a little. Adler might matter more. But what Viktor Frankl discovered is every person has an interior world, and typically you're suicidal because your world has failed. What you thought your life was about, what you thought you were supposed to do, has not come to truth. So people have feelings of worthlessness, despair, or they've done what they thought they were supposed to do, and they're just meaningless. In this chapter, Frankl discusses many times surveys that they've done when they've surveyed drug addicts. 100% of drug addicts report meaninglessness. 90% of alcoholics report meaninglessness. I mean, when I taught in my center for 5, 7 years, I remember listening to people and they got right down to it. Loss of soul, loss of meaning, whatever people thought it was. As I was often being taught, there's a God-sized hole in every person's heart. They tried to fill it with booze or alcohol. It would relieve the symptoms for a little while, and the hole just got bigger. So in this chapter on existential analysis, he's describing why they are not sufficient methods. Let me read just something to you here against Freud. Psychological phenomena are therefore reduced to drives and instincts, and therefore we seem to be determined. The drives and instincts determine us, and therefore you reconstruct the ego out of the drives. What's the meaning of life? People say there is no meaning. There's just reduce the suffering caused by drives that are in opposition to each other. So through all of this, as he dismisses those methods, he then asks, what is a core human drive? And the core human drive is to find meaning. Now, he doesn't mean find meaning in everything. I remember, people would say, oh, Viktor Frankl, find meaning in something. If it's golf, it's golf. If it's lifting weights, it's lifting weights. Not saying those are bad things. I've never played golf. I did lift weights. I had a good time in the gym, trying to get as strong as I could be. But it wasn't my ultimate life meaning. So I want to end today with a little bit about this idea of ultimate life meaning. So he gives a great correction to the term. He says, and I've given my own rephrasing. Let me give you Viktor Frankl's. He says, we are not seeking meaning in life. We are prepared for life to say to us, what is your meaning? I've often said to people, um, you don't find meaning in life, meaning finds you. When meaning finds you, it'll grab you by your lapels and shake you and look at you and say, what are you doing? So we need to phrase this. We don't look for meaning as if it's some stable thing, behind door number three. You try to live in such a way that life can address you, and that the core word here is responsibility. My responsibility to myself and my well-being, and that does not mean happiness. Sometimes the search for happiness can drive people crazy. They think to themselves, I should be happy. I remember when I was started as a marriage counselor, I say to people, why do you want to get married? Do you want to be happy? I said, wrong answer. I said, you're going to be really unhappy. They say, Rabbi Finley, you're such a pessimist. I said, no, I'm not. I'm a realist. I'll tell you what, as far as I know, um, marriage is about sacrificing your needs. There's two people, and there's a thing called the marriage. And two people who are not in service to the marriage are going to suffer terribly. Because however they thought it was going to be, there's this third thing that as it were asserts over them and says, for the sake of the marriage, you got to give that up. For the sake of the marriage, quit behaving like that. You can't say anything you can't want. You can't do anything you want. You thought that made you happy, right? Acting that way, being that way. Um, there's this thing called the marriage, which you must serve, and you must be of service to other human. And ideally, the other person is thinking that. So there are moments of great unhappiness because you're transforming as a human being from being self-centered to being transcendent. I want to build something that I'm part of, but that is beyond me. And I think human relationships are the greatest paradigm for self-transcendence. It's not about my being actualized. It's about my actualizing this thing called the relationship or the marriage or parenting, whatever you want to call it. Now, as a byproduct of that, I will become an actualized human being. So if you're invested in your happiness, you will not be actualized. You actually probably not be happy. If you're in the service of something greater than yourself, something that requires of you a kind of a nobility, a kind of an honor that you could never conceive of, that will create your fullness as a human being. From my perspective, I think the word honor and integrity are much greater aspirations for human well-being than something like happiness. Happiness is a byproduct of honor. It's one thing that I deeply believe. All right, I want to leave you with one little piece of scripture, and then I'll take any questions. Um, in this idea of uh, life, as it were, asking us. This is from the book of Micah. You'll be very familiar to most of you. And sometimes I stay away from the familiar, and then I say to myself, "Oh, maybe I should sometimes just the familiar." You'll find this on the walls of most Reformed synagogues have this somewhere. So Micah is railing against formalistic religion, especially in the term of sacrifices. What we when we say I'm bored at synagogue, they were bored watching animals getting killed. I think I would find it excited for the first 2 months, and then I would get tired of that as well. Any kind of formalism eventually runs out. And so in Micah chapter 6, is God appeased by thousands of rams with thousands of streams of oil? Um, shall I give over my firstborn to atone for my transgressions? Micah 6:8. Um, God has told you, O man, what is good. I'll read from the Hebrew here. Higid lecha adam ma tov. It's been told to you, O human being, ma tov, what is good. Uma Adonai doresh mimcha. And what God demands of you. Ki im, but only. I'll go to the Hebrew. Ki im asot mishpat, doing justice. Now, mishpat can mean law, but mishpat also has a sense of justice. Be a just, righteous person. Every place, every opportunity, every conversation, every way that you comport yourself, right? Show justice, which means being kind, reasonable, civil, considerate. All of these words are packed in here. Ahavat chesed, love chesed. Start with justice, but love chesed. Chesed is hard to translate. It's considered talked about as kindness, beneficence. Is deep regard for the inner life of a human being, and your response to another human being is chesed. To be a channel for chesed in their lives. You find this in the Mishnah where it says uh, the world stands on three things: al haTorah, on the teaching; al ha'avodah, devotion; va'al gimilut chasadim. Uh, Strange word, gimilut, lihigamel. In one context, it means to wean, but ligmol means also to repay in kind. So, for example, a retaliatory operation is a pulata gumul. So, the word gemul sometimes have a sense of of paying in kind. So, gemilut chasadim is an oxymoron. So, I'll get back at you with kindness, random acts of kindness, but not even just random acts of kindness. Want to give somebody payback? Take a breath and think this: they're suffering. Right? Yeah, I became their object du jour. I walked onto you know, onto their stage and they're acting out. It wasn't personal. It was their inner life inflicted on me. I've had to do this sometimes. I'll look at a person, I say, they're suffering. It's not about me. They're suffering. And the last thing they expect from me to do, this is where I'm really on my game, give me little chasadim. I'm going to respond with kindness. I see you're having a tough day. I'm not taking it personally. We're good. I've done that a few times in my life. It's sometimes I feel that's the fullness of my life. That's why I'm here. The moments that I could say, well, I'm going to respond with kindness. He says, Ahavat chesed. And the last thing he says here is, Hasnei lechet im Elohecha, walking humbly with your God. Here's what God demands of you. So here's what, if you want to know what life's meaning is? Life says to you, well, I'll tell you what I want from you. You're seeking meaning. Here's what I'm seeking from you. The Hebrew word is doresh. What is God seeking from you? Asot mishpat, avat chesed, and walking humbly with your God. So here the idea, how do you walk with God? Humility, you know, humility. You're not the center. It's not all about you. There's a teaching that's being uh, demands that you uh, bring yourself into. So I want to repeat where I started with the flickering lights behind me. And that is when I conceive of myself as being filled with the divine light, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, the light of God is the human soul. I imagine a little flicker within me. It is as if my consciousness uh, coaxes out the light. And as I breathe, I can feel the light becoming more and more full. And it's as if my whatever ego consciousness is there, it's overcome by the light. And for me, that light represents things such as doing justice, loving kindness, walking with God. These teachings just start to flow through me, and I become an ish acher. For a moment, I become another human being. Um, my life mission takes on a different shape. The meaning of my life takes it on a different shape because I've used a metaphor given to me by my tradition, the light, the Ner, the Sabbath lights. So I've used my tradition to evoke an inner world of meaning, and therefore meaning and mission then take me over. And then I feel, okay, I think I can teach for a little while. So thank you for joining us. All right, I'm going to end my teaching here.